Okay, so the crux of the video, should I invest in the traditional or Roth component of my retirement savings vehicle of choice? You can insert IRA, 401k, 403b, it doesn't matter. If you watch any video on this topic, what you're typically going to find is an argument that follows the lines of, if you're going to have a higher tax bracket prior to retirement than in retirement, you should favor the traditional route. That's mathematically correct. If they're going to be the same, it doesn't actually make any difference which one you contribute into. And if the opposite is true, then you would invest favoring the Roth IRA. That's pretty uncommon for most people, but that's mathematically true. Once we get past that video, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the nuances and some of the real world things that happen with your situation, specifically in your tax return, maybe in some cases behaviorally, that would change the math or the thinking behind that. And then once we get past that component of it, we're going to talk about people who have maybe contributed to a traditional their entire life, either because they didn't have access to a Roth or because they didn't understand the way that Roths work, and now they just want to do something to improve their tax situation. So let's get started with a video about contributing to either, depending on your tax rate. Okay, so this video is really just to prove the very simple mathematical point that if your marginal tax rate and or effective tax rate, more specifically your effective tax rate, is the exact same pre-retirement as it is in retirement, whether you contribute to a Roth IRA or a traditional IRA is largely irrelevant. And I'm going to show you how right now. So we're going to take two sample people, both of them in the 22% federal bracket. We're not going to worry about state taxes right now. And we're going to assume that they're both making contributions to their 401k throughout a 20-year time span. One of them is going to put money in the Roth and one's going to put money in the traditional. So if you look at this, I'm using an S&P 500 index fund. It frankly doesn't make any difference what fund you use. You can use any fund and the answer is always the same. So S&P 500 index fund, we're going to assume that that person, if they put money in the traditional 401k, has enough to contribute $10,000 a year. And this contribution is just going to be assumed to be annual, even though in practice that's not always how it is. And we're going to assume that the person that puts money in the Roth IRA, if they would have had enough to put $10,000 in the traditional, only has enough to put $7,800 in the Roth, because we're assuming that they would have to pay 22% tax on that. So if you run that scenario, what you'll see is in the last 20 or so years, somebody putting $10,000 a year into a 401k, and that one fund would have come up with just under $670,000 in that particular investment. Now we look at the person who contributed to the Roth instead. Again, they can only contribute $7,800 because they're paying 22% in taxes on that $10,000. And at $7,800 a year for 20 years, they ended up with $522,000 in change. Just to prove what that is, you can take a really simple number and say, what if we look at $669,000, I'm just going to use the round number, and we multiply it by 0.78, you get just about $522,000. So what that tells you is that, like I said, if your tax rate is the same before and after retirement and you adjust your contributions to reflect that, it won't make any difference if you put money in a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA or a traditional 401k or a Roth 401k, absent other variables, which we'll talk about in the rest of the video. All right, so now that we know the theory behind why we would choose one account type over another, what are the places where theory collides with the real world to make the answers a little bit more complicated than picking one or the other based on your marginal tax rate? So number one would be, we can't know future tax in advance. And what I mean by that is, if you take what is today, for example, the 12% tax rate, the 12% tax bracket, and in the future that's 20%, well, the math still works out in favor of maybe the decision you made if you were in the 22% prior to retirement, but the trade-off's not nearly as good as it once was. And if those things reverse, then the opposite can be true. If the 12% bracket now turns into the 24% in the future, and we deducted contributions at the 22% rate, we made a bad trade-off. That's not something that we can know in advance. Number two is that retirement taxation can be more complicated than it is during your working years, depending on where you fall in the income spectrum. So if you fall on the lower end of the income spectrum, it's possible that you may pay 0% tax on your Social Security earnings. If you're on the higher end, you could pay taxes on up to 85% of those Social Security earnings. Beyond that, if you're on the high end, you may pay something like net investment income tax. There may be a tax in the future like that that's higher or lower. The other thing is, depending on what your income is, you may end up paying surcharges related to your Medicare premiums. If you're on the high end of the spectrum, those also complicate the calculations. Number three is, even if we knew exactly how much income we needed in retirement, and we projected what that amount would be in retirement with the corresponding tax rate, we don't know exactly what returns we're going to get. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, I assumed average rates of return and I was exceptionally lucky. I might end up in a different tax bracket in retirement than I had anticipated being in. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I had exceptionally good luck with my returns and I invested and I ended up with $2 million in my 401k. If I did that at age 73 based on current required minimum distribution tables, my RMD at 73, which is when you have to start now, would be a little over $75,000. If on the other hand I had exceptionally poor returns and I ended up with only $1 million, I might have an RMD of just half that, a little over $37,000 a year. Now, regardless of whether I was single or married filing jointly, there's a reasonable chance that a $37,500 difference in RMDs has the potential to change what tax bracket I'm in, and therefore the math behind my planning, either through good luck or through bad luck, is going to end up being a little bit different. Number 4 is that there are details beyond your marginal tax rate that impact your effective tax rate. Now, typically if somebody asks me which route to go, I'll tell them a simple rule of thumb to try to figure out how much putting money in the traditional will save you is just to look at your taxable income, which is line 15 on your 1040, and figure out where that fits in the tax brackets. And I'll show you a picture of the tax brackets right here. But that would give you your effective tax rate. Now, there are a lot of things that are a little bit more relevant than that, and that's basically looking at your effective tax rate. So there are two people that could be in the exact same marginal tax bracket and pay very, very different effective tax rates. And in just a second, I'm going to show you an example of that. But if you want to know what your effective tax rate is, you actually have to look at line 24 of your 1040, which is total tax, and you divide that number by your total income, and then you'll get your effective tax. And suffice to say, two people in the same bracket could be so far apart that it could impact the decision on whether you choose to go the traditional or Roth route. Okay, so I'm going to show you a quick example of a situation where two people making the exact same amount of money, two couples, could have the exact same marginal tax bracket, but that wouldn't give us enough information to tell us whether it made sense to invest in their Roth or traditional 401k. So two couples, both of them making $200,000 a year, both going to put $20,000 into their 401k. In this specific example, I put it both into the traditional 401k. So on their W-2, they're going to see total income of $180,000. And you see the couple on the left has no kids. The couple on the right has 6 kids. All right. I'm going to show you the tax report for both of them so you can understand some of the differences between the two. So what you can see here is the couple with no kids had a marginal tax rate of 22%, which we already knew, $152,000, and that bracket goes up to $190,000. But they had an average rate, which is the same thing as saying their effective rate, of 13.4%. The second example is the couple that has 6 kids, all of which fall into an age range where they would get a child tax credit for them. Child tax credit is actually $2,000 per child, and there's not a limit to the number of children that you can claim the child tax credit on, assuming that they qualify. And so you can see this person, this couple I should say, had the same amount of taxable income, $152,000, which falls squarely in the 22% rate. But despite having the same marginal rate, their average rate or effective rate was only 6.7. So they actually paid total tax of a little over $12,000, which was $12,000 less than the other couple who didn't have any kids. And so you can see this is a pretty big distinction between the two, is that you have to understand things that happen after marginal tax rate that could impact the total tax you pay. So in this situation, I would look at a couple like this and say, you might be in the 22% bracket, but because you're in a favorable situation from a tax credit perspective, it might make sense to consider the Roth component in your case. All right, number 5 is a little bit more of a behavioral take on this. And it has a lot to do with human nature and the way people think about things. But number 5 is basically, a lot of people aren't going to go to the trouble to calculate how much putting money in the traditional will save them in taxes. And they might be asking themselves the question, should I put 10% of my money from my income into my traditional 401k or my Roth 401k? And frankly, that's the wrong way to go about it. But if that's the way you're going to do it, then doing it in the Roth is a no-brainer, because by doing it in the Roth, you're effectively saving more money, because your after-tax income will absolutely be higher in retirement unless somehow you're in the 0% effective rate in retirement. So if you're not going to go to the trouble to figure out what the difference is in terms of taxes and save more in the traditional, if that makes sense, then saving it in the Roth is probably the correct way to go. All right, so that is the primer on Roths versus traditional retirement plans. And I will say this, Roths certainly give you more flexibility and freedom, but if you really want to maximize your wealth, it pays to understand the nuance, because traditionals do make a lot of sense for a lot of people. Now, I'm going to end this video by having a little bit of a take on where the discourse around this has gone in our industry and frankly across the country. I think at this stage of the game, people in the US have such a short attention span. Not a lot of people are even going to get to the end of this video, but it's very common these days to take complicated situations and to oversimplify them because complicating things can lead people to inaction. And it is true that if that's the case, you're doing harm to people by overcomplicating things. So a lot of people in finance just dumb things down because it's better for people to do something with an oversimplified answer than it is to try to teach them something complicated if it's going to lead to inaction. That being said, that is where the opportunity lies for people who want to do the work and understand finance at a little bit deeper level, okay? If you're willing to learn, if you're willing to ask the right questions, finance will get a lot easier for you. And oversimplifying things, as nice as it is not going to get you that far. So that's what this entire channel is about. That's what my website is about. If you found this helpful, like the video, comment on it. If there are other things that you want to hear about specific to this topic or other topics, and then subscribe to the channel if you want to learn things at a little higher level than you maybe would from other sources.